Well, I clicked on record, and I forgot to see the little pop-up window that says record on the computer or record in the cloud. So until I clicked one of those, it didn't record anything at all. Okay, it's recording now. This Zoom is just so complicated. You have to click twice. All right. So scholars are not quite sure where Paul was, whether he was in prison in Rome or prison in Ephesus. But then the scholars also say, well, it really doesn't make much difference as to how we understand the letter. It would make a difference as to the date that Paul wrote. But again, that doesn't make any difference as to what he wrote. And we can understand the letter quite well, regardless of the circumstances that Paul was in. Of greater significance for understanding the letter are the circumstances that the Philippians were in, that the Philippians were being persecuted, and that they were in a city where Roman citizenship was a pride of the city. And Paul will address some of that citizenship pride a little bit in the letter. But for the most part, what he writes can be understood regardless of those circumstances. The scholars try to understand as best they can, and in the process of trying that, they are examining the letter in great detail, and which is a good thing. And they're also saying, well, maybe this might help something, and after they do a lot of work, they find out, well, it hasn't really helped. But it was still important for them to do the work to find out whether that was the case or not. In some cases, it can be helpful to understand some smaller issues in the letters. Here in Philippians, we can pretty well take it as it comes, and there's a lot of I don't know, interesting material in there. So let's look at the letter itself. I will go ahead and share the screen, and we can start reading. Unless some of you have questions. Oh yeah, I wanted to comment too that sometimes people are reluctant to ask questions when the recording is on. I don't know, usually the questions are good for everybody, but sometimes people don't want their questions to be aired to the general public. So I will turn off the recording at 7:50, and we can have more questions at that point if you would like, or we can just have general conversation. Whatever happens at 7:50 will be off the record, as it were. It will not be on the recording, so we can have a freer discussion if you'd like that. But we can have discussion and questions before then as well. Feel free, and I'll stop and ask if you have any comments on things during that time too. And so this is one opportunity too. I've already given the introduction to the circumstances of the letter. And if you have any questions or comments about what I've said so far, then and now's a good time. Anybody? Oh yes, Yoli, you're muted.
Yes. So the writers of this letter were Paul and Titus.
Paul and Timothy. Yeah.
Oh, Timothy. Okay.
Yeah, Titus helped write many of the letters, and Timothy did too. And this letter just happens to mention Paul and Timothy. I don't know where Titus was. Maybe he was traveling and bringing messages back and forth.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's share the screen, the text of where we are. Here we go. All right, do you see the text there?
Yep.
Okay, great. Philippians. I just copied the whole book here from the NIV. Sometimes the other translations can be helpful too, but we'll just use the NIV as the standard for now. If you find something interesting in another translation, then feel free to share that too. So it starts out as the Greek letters normally did by saying who the writers are and who it's going to. And that's kind of what our envelopes on our letters say. You get a regular envelope, and in the upper left-hand corner you have who it's from, and in the middle you have who it's to. So if our letters start in a similar way, even though there was no postal service back then, they didn't need addresses, but it was still part of the formal way to start a letter, who it's from, who it's to. So Paul introduces himself as Paul and Timothy. Timothy was with him, but most of the letter is written in the first person singular. And like down in verse 3, Paul says, I thank my God every time I remember you. He's not talking about we or our. Timothy seems to kind of drops out. And some of his other letters, Paul continues using the word we, he and his companions were discussing what to write, and they are in agreement on what will be in the letter. Here, Paul just says, Timothy's mentioned, but no further use is made of that. So we don't really want to know what to make of that. But he introduces himself as servants of Christ Jesus, or literally as slaves. In the ancient world, I don't know, 20-some% of the population were slaves. So it was quite common. But a slave of Caesar was of much higher rank than a slave who worked in the salt mine. There were different ranks of slavery, and if you were a slave of Caesar, you could basically boss the governor around, because the emperor would be sending his slave to give instructions to a provincial governor. So who you were a slave of is very important. And Paul says, he's the slave of the highest authority possible, Christ Jesus. Some scholars connect this with the Old Testament servant of Yahweh. Perhaps Paul is thinking of that, but it's difficult to prove. This is just an ordinary word that he's using here as slaves of Christ Jesus. In some of his letters, he is anxious to defend his apostolic authority. With the people in Philippi, he doesn't seem to feel any need for that. They already respect him as an apostle. They know he has that kind of authority. He doesn't need to refer to it. But the word servant also fits into some of the teaching that Paul wants to include in this letter too, that he wants the Philippian believers to view themselves as servants of Christ. So Paul is not using a title. It's not unique to him. It's a title that they can all share in. That, in fact, the letter of Philippians often talks about sharing. It has a high concentration of words that start with a prefix SYN, like synergy or things working together. In fact, Paul seems to invent some new words starting with this prefix of together we're doing this. We're sharing in, we are fellow laborers, we are fellow sufferers. He's creating words to encourage the people to see themselves as all in this together. We are in the same, on the same side as Christ, same side as each other, that we are working together. So this use of the word servant, of a term that the Philippians can see themselves taking on as well, that helps support what he's writing. So then he writes to all God's holy people, saints. The word holy means set apart for a specific purpose. All Christians are saints in that sense. We are set apart for God's use. Well, and in Christ Jesus at Philippi. So that's where they were. Then, unusually, he mentions the overseers and deacons. This is the only letter in which the opening part of the letter mentions officers in the church. Some scholars have thought that these overseers, or bishops is another word, bishops, Paul seems to use bishops and pastors interchangeably, and elders. Here he's using overseer, which is another translation is bishop. The Greek word is episkopos, which means looking over. But that episkopos got turned into piskop, and that got turned into bishop. So the English word derived from the Greek, although it's hard for most English speakers to see how the word bishop is related to episkopos. Anyway, so Paul greets them, and scholars aren't quite sure why he does that. Did they have something to do with perhaps the gift that was sent? Or perhaps there's, in chapter 4, he talks about problems of some disunity in the church. And that could have been a little bit of bickering over titles. So Paul mentions these people who have certain titles. He doesn't give any names for who had those titles. But the final answer is we really don't know why he refers to them in the introduction in this letter and not in others. We assume that all churches had some kind of leadership, but he rarely picks any out in terms of titles. He'll give names instead of titles. And then his typical greeting is grace and peace. Grace is a Christianized version of the typical Greek greeting, charein, greetings. So instead of charein, he uses charis, grace. That's a slight alteration, but it's a Christianized version. And peace is the typical Hebrew greeting, shalom. So that's been adapted in there too. All of Paul's letters start with that, grace and peace. The next part can vary a little bit from God. In this case, it's from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, mentioning both there. So he's writing as a designated representative of God and Jesus Christ, writing to the believers in Philippi, giving them grace and peace. Any comments there? All right, the next section is, it's labeled here, Thanksgiving and Prayer. Even so-called secular Greek letters usually had a Thanksgiving section in which they would give thanks to their gods for their health or for some circumstances. Paul uses that, but he makes a much greater use of it than most letters did, because he will expand that thanks. And the things that he includes in this Thanksgiving section are kind of a precursor, a foreshadowing of topics that he will cover in the course of the letter itself. Here he's thanking, he's not directly thanking God for the Philippian believers, but he's thanking God because he's remembering the Philippian believers. So, he remembers them, so he thanks God. And presumably we fill in the gap there. Well, he's thankful that they are part of his life, part of his ministry that they are sharing in the gospel with him. In all my prayers for you, I always pray with joy. So there's a first mention of this common word for the letter, joy. And I think the reason he mentions it so often is because he was in prison and they were being persecuted, and he is kind of compensating for those things. They were depressed. So he was trying to emphasize that we have many reasons to rejoice. So he's giving them this right off the bat. In prison, even in prison, he can pray with joy. And he says in verse 5, why? Because of your partnership in the gospel, because you are sharing with me. You have accepted the gospel. And not only that, partnership includes the idea that they are giving the financial support to him in bringing the gospel to other regions. So their partnership can come in several ways, whether they're a reception or whether in their giving. So Paul is very thankful for that. And as he says, they've been doing it from the first day until now. They've always been supporting him in the work he's doing. And they were not giving him these headaches like the Corinthian church had. The Corinthian church was on a real mess and caused Paul a lot of grief, but Philippians did not. So in verse 6, he says, I am confident that he who began a good work in you, God, will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. What God started, he will finish. He's addressing perhaps some anxiety that they had. Did they feel abandoned, or did they feel that God had abandoned Paul and allowed him to be in prison? Either way, Paul is giving them assurance that no, God's not going to give up on us. He started this knowing what he was getting into, knowing what we would get into, and he is going to see us through till the day of Christ Jesus, as he says. They all look forward to the return of Christ when this struggle with carrying a Christian life in this world that's going a different direction can cause us. So he gives them assurance on that. Any comments there? Yes.
My comment. I was preparing a sermon for October 16, and the sermon I was preparing is what is a church member? I'd like to focus on what is a saint, what is a church member for this one. So my mind is focused on that. So I was thinking, how does Paul look at the Philippians? How does he view them? And I was just writing, as you're writing here from verses 1 to 6. Paul calls them one, bond servant, 2, holy people, 3, kind of implied united with church leadership, with deacons. 4th, they kind of receive, or they are possessor of grace and peace. Next one is I wrote they are worthy to be remembered. That's what Paul said, they're worthy to be remembered. And then there it also says worthy to be prayed for. That's what Paul is saying. And then because they are faithful to the gospel, because not only faithful, they are partners. They are part of the work of being a part, or as you said, supporters of the gospel. They are also reasons for Paul's joy. It says they give me joy, to Paul. They are also workmanship. It says workmanship of God, that God will complete them, the work he's doing. When I was just writing all of this, verses 1 to 6, and there's, when you look at it from a kind of another perspective, it's amazing that how much you can glean from how Paul viewed the church. And just those 6 verses, I got a lot for my future sermon.
Yeah, a good preview there. We look forward to that. Yeah, that's
Judy is raising
good
her hand.
observations there.
I have a
Judy.
comment.
Yes, Judy.
You were saying that he used the word joy because sometimes things weren't so good in Philippi. Yeah, the impression I had from reading Philippians is that he was very happy, and that the people there were content and happy. Can you elaborate a little bit on that so far as the fact of joy being because he was encouraging them in joy because they didn't have it?
Yeah, I think a good question. Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. He did have joy. He wasn't just pretending for their benefit, but he did want to. They had heard he was in prison. They were concerned about his circumstances. Prison in the first century was a pretty dismal place to be. They didn't. Yeah. So. Maybe he's, whether they are thinking how, he is suffering, we feel badly for him. He's responding, okay, you don't need to feel badly for me. There are lots of positive things to look at here. So he brings those out. He doesn't talk about the hardships, even though there would have been some. He doesn't mention those. He's mentioning the positive things because that is what he wants them to focus on. He says, when you see me from God's perspective, you'll have reason to rejoice. Of course, when you look at me from the perspective of the Roman Empire, maybe it would look bad. I look like a social deviant, but don't look at it that way. That's not the real story. The real story is the one that God says. God says you are achieving something earth-shaking, marvelous, divine, and you have reason to be confident, reason to be joyful for what God is doing through you, and will reward you for doing it. So yeah, it's partly a thing of perspective. Yeah, if you're just looking at physical circumstances, yeah, that could be a problem, but don't look at the physical, look at the spiritual circumstances, look at it from the perspective of the gospel. So he is, whether Philippians had a problem with this or not, he is pointing them to what the proper view is. Did that answer your question, comment?
It sort of answers my question. It's just that I don't see much really negative in the book.
Right.
So I think about it in terms that he's trying to, other than he's reassuring them, he's not really kind of worried that they're kind of feeling sad.
Right. It's well, I guess people are reading kind of the circumstances. Why would Paul talk about joy the most in a letter in which he is in prison? He could talk about joy and some of his other letters. Wonderful things are happening. Churches are starting in this city and that, and he, in his other letters, he does not bring out those things, but he emphasizes joy in this situation where on a surface it might look bad, but he's pointing out that the surface is not the reality.
So it's really because he's in prison that he's emphasizing joy. Well,
and the Philippians too are facing some sort of persecution, it seems. So in both of those, he says, okay, I'm in prison. You sent word that you were concerned for me. You know, you don't need to be concerned that I'm suffering and in misery. You have reason to rejoice for my circumstances. But he also wants them to understand their own circumstances are similar whenever they face persecution, that they too can look on the positive things of their circumstances and not focus on the physical details that may not be so good. So he's using himself as a lesson for their future suffering, or even current suffering, perhaps.
I see sometimes suffering, we hear so much about persecution and see such an evidence about persecution in the different letters. Yet I look at it from the fact that it's, well, I have things going on that aren't exactly persecution, but they're disturbing me. And I look at joy and look at their persecutions. This more you're talking about me being sick, you know, or be having this difficulty or that difficulty. Even my friends and stuff. Looking at the viewpoint, not just of persecutions, but things happening in
Yeah.
life.
Right. Yeah, and like if we can be joyful even in persecution, well, we should be able to be joyful in those other negative things that happen in life, whether it's our physical health or whether it's relationships that are going wrong, or it's the neighbor's noisy dog.
Yeah, and it's, you know, it's so easy to get bent out of shape. And you're
Yeah,
thinking whether it's the dog or the health or whatever it is, it's so easy to get bent out of shape. But he wasn't getting bent out of shape because of prison.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. It's a good lesson for all of us. Yeah. All right, let's look at verse 7.
Lee raised her hand. Lee
Oh.
Sniffen.
Did I hit?
Yeah, Lee Sniffen, raise her hand.
Oh, okay. I don't see everybody on my screen. So yeah, it's you might have to call out.
I wanted to
Lee.
comment on what Judy was saying about what you just explained about the process of the positive and the negative. It's so,
Yeah.
that is so real and so valid. It reminds me of, through the years, you know, this message has come to me in so many different ways. And some of the simple explanations, like looking at the glass half full rather than half empty, and that it's the physical versus the spiritual. And so we have these two dynamics that we have to choose which one we're going to look at, which way we're going to go, because what she's explaining comes very natural to our physical being. But then we have the calling of our spiritual existence. And so those two things that would reminded me of that, so rich and so real.
Very real.
Mhm.
But it doesn't change anything that God has in mind.
Right. Anyone else? All right. Verse 7. It is right for me to feel this way about all of you, since I have you in my heart. And whether I am in chains or defending and confirming the gospel, all of you share in God's grace with me. So here he's mentioning how they share again. These words about defending and confirming, they're also used in court cases, for first century court cases. So he's defending and he's presenting his defense, he's presenting his argument in favor of the gospel. So whether he's referring to being on trial or not, he's kind of using the same language that would be used in a trial, defending apologia as a defense. But his point, his main point in the verse there is that Paul feels confident about the Philippian believers. He said, yeah, it's right for me to feel this way. He's making a point of saying this to encourage them in what they're doing. So no matter my circumstances, you all share in God's grace with me. Verse 8, God can testify how I long for all of you with the affection of Christ Jesus. He often, in other letters, he expresses how he longs to be with the people. And that was a commonplace in letters of the time. That people wished they could be there in person. And the letter was just a poor substitute, as it were. But Paul's letters did a whole lot of good because they got preserved for us to read as well. So we're thankful. And in some ways, they were not maybe God engineered the circumstances so that this poor substitute was actually a greater ministry than Paul could have ever dreamed of, because it reaches us as well.
Yes, yes.
But again, the focus of that paragraph is encouragement for the Philippian readers.
Yes.
So verse 9, he says, and this is my prayer. So here's getting what he prays to God that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight. So he's saying what you got is already good, but this prayer could be said for any of us too, that we would all grow in knowledge, that the love may abound in knowledge. Love doesn't always have knowledge to guide it in what it does. Sometimes our love is misguided. But this is another word that Paul will see several times in this letter about knowledge, or about how our thoughts are. Paul wants to encourage them to think through their situations. He will say, let this mind be in you. Later in the chapter 4, he says, think on these things. He's talking about their mental involvement in the gospel, that they're, by thinking things through, they will be able to be in better step with what the gospel is.
Yes.
He could have had this stress in any of his letters, really, but for some reason he includes it, particularly in the letter to the Philippians. One Greek word, phronesis, is more common in this letter than any of the others, and that's about thinking or making decisions, discernment, that sort of word, meaning of the word. But here, in verse 9, he's talking about that your love may abound in knowledge, depth of insight, that your understanding of things. Wisdom might be another close synonym there of how we are to use our affections in an educated way. If we don't know what we're doing, we might have good motives, but they don't necessarily achieve what we wanted them to.
Yes.
So that in verse 10 elaborates that discernment a little bit more. So you may be able to discern what is best, not just what is good, but what is best. And you might be pure and blameless for the day of Christ. Several of Paul's letters talk about He wants the people to be blameless for the day of Christ. Worthy is, sometimes they use that word as well. Of course, the only way that we can be blameless is through Christ's forgiveness. We all fall short, but the point he's wanting to make here is that we all stay faithful, that we are continuing to be faithful to what Jesus is and wants us to be doing. That's the way we can be pure and blameless for the day of Christ. Christ's sacrifice covers all our shortcomings. Paul addresses that elsewhere, but that doesn't seem to be what he's talking about here. He wants his readers and everybody really to continue on the path. God is going to complete the work, but we need to continue with it. Verse 11, that we will be filled with the fruit of righteousness, the result of righteousness. Or this could be called this, the fruit of righteousness could be the result of righteousness, but it could also be used, the Greek construction here could also mean that it's the fruit which is righteousness, that they could be synonyms, that you're being filled with this righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ. And that's the fruit of your faith. In Romans, Paul talks about the obedience of faith. Now, he talks about how our faith works itself out in love. Faith has results in our lives. That seems to be what he's getting at here in verse 11. He wants our lives to have the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. That's all part of the same picture, that what we do is for his glory, not our own. Any comments, questions? Yes, Bernie.
Thank you, Pastor Mike. I thought you mentioned something about the depth of insight so that we may be able to discern what is best. And you mentioned that it doesn't only say good, but it says best. That kind of attracted me, and I was thinking it's a depth of insight for what is best, because oftentimes it is so easy for us Christians to settle for the good. That's good enough, and I don't need to. We settle for the good. We are consumer people. Just it's good enough for me. But as you mentioned, it's doesn't talk about just the good, but God has something not even better. But God has the best for us, as mentioned here. So I thought, wow, that's a good sermon in some ways.
Yeah, it's past 7:50, so I'll turn off the recording.